I never thought I'd watch someone in broad daylight, wearing an official homeowners association polo, rifling through my rose bushes like a raccoon rummaging for scraps. But that's exactly what I witnessed on an unassuming Tuesday afternoon, an image I won't soon forget. One second, I was finishing a phone call in my living room. The next, I was sprinting outside in my house slippers, shouting, "Hey, you, what do you think you're doing? Let me back up. My name's Vincent, and I moved into this suburban subdivision, Emerald Vista Estates, about 6 months ago. I'm semi-retired in my early 50s, and my big dream for my golden years was to finally design and care for the perfect garden. Pristine green lawns, a cluster of bird feeders, and a flourishing bed of roses that I'd spent months pruning into immaculate shape. Some guys have cars. I have flowers. It's a deal I made with myself years ago when I decided to slow down and savor life's little pleasures. But if there's one roadblock to suburban bliss, it's the dreaded HOA, the self-appointed neighborhood watchdog that holds entire communities hostage with obscure bylaws. I was well aware that Emerald Vista had a stringent HOA when I bought the house, but on the surface it sounded tolerable. Keep your lawn trimmed, don't paint the house neon orange, that kind of thing. Seemed easy enough. Then I discovered Karen. Karen was not just any HOA representative. She was the self-proclaimed queen. Whenever I tried to glean even the slightest bit of personal information from neighbors, they'd only shrug and say, "Be careful with that one." She had the signature bob haircut, a perpetual scowl, and a pointed stare that seemed a laser in on every perceived shortcoming. Within a week of moving in, she left me a 3-page note in my mailbox about how I'd placed my trash can 6 inches too close to the curb. According to her, everything was subject to fines. And I do mean everything. I tolerated her petty notices for a while, though each new complaint built up like water behind a dam. But trespassing? That was a new low I hadn't anticipated. Yet there she was, rummaging around my yard, snapping pictures with her phone, making scribbles in a little notebook. She nearly jumped out of her skin when I marched over. "Karen, right?" I asked. My voice was shaking with frustration, but I forced a polite smile. "What exactly are you looking for in my rose bushes?" She was wearing an emerald green polo with the embroidered HOA logo on the chest, hair pinned back in a neat little clip. She looked me up and down like I was the suspicious one. "Just conducting a property compliance check," she said, affecting an air of authority. "We had complaints that you're growing invasive plant species." That took me aback. "Roses? Invasive?" I repeated. "They're from a local nursery. There's nothing invasive about them." She gave a tense shrug. "We have guidelines for the types of flora permitted within the community. I need to ensure your garden meets those guidelines." "Oh, do you?" I countered, trying to hide the anger that was threatening to bubble over. "And while you do that, you think you can just walk right into my backyard? No notice, no permission?" Her eyes darted away. She stuffed her phone into her pocket. "It's within our bylaws that HOA representatives may inspect questionable areas. It was in your contract." I knew my contract forward and backward. Nothing authorized random rummaging through my yard in the middle of the day. But Karen, with her unflinching confidence, seemed to think she was bulletproof. I sighed, exasperated. "This ends now. Get off my property. If you have issues with my roses, you can send me a letter. Or an email. I've got both." She didn't budge. "I'm afraid I can't do that." I pointed to the gate. "Off my property." Now, that must have struck a chord, because her face went rigid. She puffed up like a seething bull, but eventually clacked down the pathway in her sensible flats, out the gate and onto the sidewalk. Before leaving, she spun around and glared at me. "You'll be hearing from me," she said, wagging a finger in my direction. Then she stomped away. I stood there, heart pounding, disbelief coating every thought. It wasn't just the trespassing. Something about her smug sense of entitlement sent a chill up my spine. She'd already proven she wouldn't hesitate to cross lines. If she found issues with my yard now, what would she do later? Over the next week, I convinced myself it had been a one-off. Maybe Karen was just feeling particularly overzealous that day. But an unsettling question lingered. Did I really want to wait for her to pull another stunt? The sense of intrusion was jarring. I couldn't enjoy my own backyard without imagining her wandering around, snapping more pictures. A few nights later, I even set up my old motion sensor camera by the garden, just for peace of mind. Sometimes, though, that's how it starts. A single moment that seems inconsequential becomes the domino that tips all the others. Because after that first confrontation, I realized that Karen wasn't finished. Not even close. The question was, how far would she go? And how far would I have to go to protect what was mine? I learned pretty quickly that property compliance checks were just the tip of Karen's iceberg. Within the next couple of weeks, she escalated her campaign in ways I never saw coming. It started subtly, a fresh letter on my porch citing unapproved fence decorations, my modest hanging flower basket. A notice claiming my mailbox was 3 shades too bright compared to the approved color palette. It was white, for crying out loud. As ridiculous as it was, I tried to comply wherever I could. I was never one to stir up needless drama, especially in a neighborhood I hoped to call home for years. Repainting my mailbox seemed silly, but if it avoided confrontation, so be it. Besides, I had my garden to focus on, and that brought me more joy than bickering with some self-important HOA rep. Then the real bombshell landed. One morning, I found a large, glaring poster taped to my door. In big block letters, it read, "Violation, unauthorized shed construction." Below that, a second line commanded, "Tear down or face fines of up to $1,000 per week." My jaw dropped. I didn't even have a shed. When I read the fine print, I discovered that the shed in question was actually my greenhouse, a modest, prefabricated kit I'd assembled to nurse my more delicate roses and keep them safe during colder months. I got in the kit from a local hardware store, followed city regulations, and installed it near the back fence. It was see-through, for goodness sake, barely more than sturdy plastic walls. But apparently, from Karen's perspective, that small greenhouse threatened the sanctity of Emerald Vista. No neighbor had ever complained. In fact, 3 of them, Linda, Mark, and Joseph, regularly stopped by to ask for gardening tips or snag a few seed for their own plants. They told me how lovely my greenhouse looked at dusk, catching the last of the sunlight. But evidently, it wasn't lovely enough for the HOA's rulebook. I decided it was time to get some clarity, so I combed through the thick neighborhood guidelines. Buried on page 46 of the official PDF, I discovered a single sentence about utility structures or outbuildings requiring pre-approval from the HOA board. The text was ambiguous. Nowhere did it mention greenhouse kits. But that's how HOAs get you. Vague language that can be twisted to mean whatever the board wants. Determined not to be a pushover, I called the HOA office line. It took 4 tries before someone picked up. Finally, a voice I recognized. Karen, official tone in full force. "Emerald Vista Homeowners Association, this is Karen. How can I help you?" "This is Vincent Gray," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "I got a notice this morning about my greenhouse. I'm hoping to speak to someone about an appeal, or at least to clarify the guidelines." I heard a sniff on the other end of the line. "Good morning, Mr. Gray. Yes, I'm familiar with the greenhouse in question." I swallowed. "Well, I'd like to schedule a meeting. Do I need to tear it down immediately? Or can we negotiate a solution?" Her silence crackled. "It's an unapproved structure, Mr. Gray. As stated in your violation notice, you have 7 days to comply. After that, the fines will accumulate at the specified rate." My stomach sank. "I've read the guidelines, Karen. Nowhere does it explicitly say a greenhouse is disallowed. Could we—" She cut me off, voice tightening. "Our guidelines are quite clear about outbuildings. Besides, we've received multiple complaints from neighbors who are concerned about an unsightly addition that disrupts the view. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do to help." A white-hot flash of anger shot through me. Multiple complaints? That was a lie, unless Karen had conjured them from thin air. My neighbors loved the greenhouse, but I recognized the tactic. She was leaning on those so-called complaints to back her stance, no matter how fabricated. "Is there truly no compromise?" I asked, my voice inching towards desperation. "I can paint it or plant hedges around it to camouflage the structure." 7 days, Mr. Gray, she repeated. Then came the click of her hanging up. I stared at the phone in disbelief. This went beyond petty power trips about trash cans or mailbox paint. Karen was actively trying to ruin one of the few hobbies that gave me daily joy. and the thought of tearing down that greenhouse felt like letting her win. My blood boiled. I decided it was time to talk to my neighbors and see if anyone else had been cornered by the same rules. After all, if we banded together, maybe we could push back. Linda had a robust vegetable garden behind her house. Did she ever get grief about that? Joseph had a small workshop for woodworking. Mark had a pergola that sometimes climbed over the fence line. If there was a pattern, we needed to address it collectively. I spent the afternoon knocking on doors, explaining my predicament. To my surprise, the entire block had stories about Karen's tyranny. Linda had once been forced to uproot her beloved bird of paradise shrubs because they weren't in the approved color scheme. Mark had been fined $500 for an offensive wind chime that apparently broke noise regulations. Joseph was slapped with a penalty for installing a small pond to raise koi fish. Each had caved under the mounting costs and intimidation. That's when the seeds of a plan began to form in my mind. Karen thrived on intimidation and isolation. People cowered because she always threatened them individually. But united, could we stand up to her? Could we gather enough evidence that she was operating beyond the scope of any reasonable bylaw? I didn't know the exact blueprint yet, but I felt a spark of hope. There was strength in numbers. And if Karen's next trespass was more brazen, I might finally have the proof I needed to confront her head on. Because something told me that this greenhouse saga was just Karen's opening move. I just never imagined how far she'd go to make her point, and how much it would cost me to put up a fight. A few days after our conversation, Karen turned up the heat. Every morning, as I sat on my porch with coffee in hand, I'd see her car roll by at a painfully slow crawl. She'd crane her neck, narrowing her eyes at my yard, clearly on the prowl for anything else to report. The neighbors told me she'd do the same by their houses, too, driving in loops, looking for infractions, snapping pictures with her phone like some amateur detective. Meanwhile, the rest of us had started a small alliance of sorts. We texted each other whenever Karen was spotted creeping around. Linda joked that we should start a neighborhood watch for Karen, turning the tables on her perpetual scrutiny. Though we tried to maintain our sense of humor, the tension weighed heavily on us. Most of my neighbors had simply given up fighting her. They'd seen too many people slapped with staggering fines and, ultimately, threatened with legal action from the HOA. Without a united front, they just accepted Karen's demands as part of life in Emerald Vista. But I wasn't ready to fold. My greenhouse's 7-day deadline was rapidly approaching, and I kept scanning every line of the HOA bylaws, searching for any loophole. I even found an older version of the rules, dating back a decade or more, that contained a few contradictory statements about allowed structures for horticultural purposes. It mentioned that small greenhouses used for the cultivation of ornamental plants could be permissible if they didn't exceed a certain size. My greenhouse fit all the criteria. The question was whether that older version of the document was still valid. All the while, Karen intensified her campaign. She left more notices on my porch, one of which was a final warning typed in bold red letters. Underneath, she threatened to have the HOA board escalate this case to the city if I didn't remove or dismantle the unapproved outbuilding by the 7th day. It felt like one of those old Western standoffs, except the bullets were replaced by thick legalese and mail notices. Then came the final straw. Karen trespassed again. This time, she did it after sundown. I'd set up that motion sensor camera weeks ago, convinced that if she ever came snooping again, I'd catch her in the act. Sure enough, on day 6, I was in my living room when I got an alert on my phone. Motion detected in backyard. My heart lurched. I carefully edged toward the window, peering into the darkness. At first, I couldn't see anything, just the silhouettes of my garden. But then I spotted a faint glow, like someone using a flashlight under a jacket. I dashed to my back door, quietly opened it, and crept outside. My pulse hammered in my ears as I made my way around the corner of the house, unsure what I'd find. Could be a raccoon, or maybe a thief. But as I inched closer, I recognized that green HOA polo reflecting in the moonlight. It was Karen. She was kneeling by my greenhouse door, shining a small flashlight inside, probably checking each shelf for contraband or something equally ridiculous. I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hands trembling with a mix of fear and fury. Then I clear my throat. She nearly dropped her flashlight, but rather than looking apologetic, she glared at me. "I have every right to inspect this structure," she hissed, standing up. "You're in violation, and I need to document the extent." "It's 9 o'clock at night," I whispered harshly, conscious of my neighbors sleeping. "Get out my yard. I'm calling the police if you don't leave right now." She pointed her flashlight straight into my eyes. "You can't stop me. This is official HOA business." My patience snapped like a twig. "There is nothing official about prowling around someone's backyard in the dark," I growled. "Now get out before I escort you off myself." She held her ground for a moment, tension radiating off her in waves. Then she scoffed, turned on her heel, and headed back toward the gate. Once she was out, I heard the latch click, followed by the sharp slam of her car door starting up on the street. I stood there, my heart pounding, my hands shaking in the chilly night air. For a moment, I couldn't even move. I felt violated, furious, and strangely victorious all at once. Because now I had irrefutable proof of her trespassing, something the HOA couldn't ignore. Video footage, time-stamped, her face plainly visible. She crossed a line that no amount of bylaws would justify. That same night, I emailed the footage to the local police, along with a detailed explanation of the repeated trespasses. I also sent a copy to the HOA board, addressing it directly to the president, a man named Robert Cartwright, who I'd barely met. I demanded an immediate review of Karen's conduct. Of course, I didn't expect an overnight transformation, but I wanted them to know that if Karen continued her vigilante tactics, they'd have a real legal battle on their hands. Enough was enough. However, Karen proved once again how persistent she could be. The next morning, I woke up to a barrage of texts from neighbors. Karen was going door to door, distributing a new flyer claiming my greenhouse was posing a safety hazard and that I was actively threatening board members. She was spinning some tall tale about me, brandishing a weapon during her nighttime inspection. Absolutely false, of course, but fear spreads quickly in a quiet neighborhood. By mid-afternoon, I stepped out to my porch and found a cluster of neighbors standing anxiously on the sidewalk. Linda waved me over. "She's telling everyone you pulled a gun on her," Linda said quietly, her eyes wide in disbelief. I don't believe it for a second, but some folks are scared. Anger boiled in my gut. I never threatened her with anything. I just told her to leave my property. Linda placed a reassuring hand on my arm. "We know. A few of us want to help any way we can. We've had enough of her bullying." So that was it. Karen was weaponizing fear and gossip to turn the neighborhood against me. Evidently, if she couldn't silence me with fines, she tried to paint me as a criminal. But I wasn't giving up. I had the video footage, and I wasn't above letting the law settle this. If Karen thought she could bend rules and reality to her liking, she was about to find out that some lines can't be crossed without repercussions. As the sun set on that sixth day, I felt a determined, steely resolve crystallize inside me. Tomorrow was the final day before the HOA's threatened fines were set to begin. One way or another, the clock was ticking. Karen had staked her claim. Now it was my turn to push back, and I had every intention of blocking her out of my life for good, no matter what it took. The morning of day 7 dawned with ominous clouds overhead, as if the weather itself sensed the tension gripping the neighborhood. I was up early, cradling a mug of black coffee, replaying the nighttime trespass video on my phone. The police had acknowledged receipt of my evidence, but the wheels of justice turned slowly. Meanwhile, Karen was doubtless sharpening her claws, waiting for any excuse to slap me with those $1,000 per week fines. But I had a plan, one that took shape after hearing everyone else's experiences. It started with the Neighborhood Alliance. Over a dozen of us were tired of Karen's manufactured violations, and I convinced them it was time to approach the HOA board collectively. Armed with evidence of her harassment, we could force them to intervene. I also wanted to shore up my property lines, literally. If Karen couldn't respect a simple keep out sign, maybe I needed something stronger. A few calls to a local fence company yielded a rush appointment for new, taller fencing around my backyard. It wouldn't be cheap, but if it meant peace of mind, I was ready to sign the check. I had my contractor friend, Peter, come out that very morning. Within an hour, he'd started marking the yard with stakes to indicate where the new fence would go. It wouldn't be finished overnight, but it would send a clear message: trespassers not welcome. Just as Peter was finishing, I heard the roar of an engine. Karen's sedan pulled up along the curb, and out she came, brandishing a clipboard like a battle shield. She marched up my driveway, ignoring Peter as if he didn't exist, and rounded on me with a look of triumph. "Your time's up," she declared. "Have you removed the greenhouse?" I square my shoulders. "No, and I'm not going to. I found an older version of the HOA bylaws that specifically allows for greenhouse structures under a certain size, which mine meets." Karen's mouth twisted into an ugly sneer. "Those documents are outdated. The current bylaws are the only valid reference. I'm here to issue the first of your fines." She began scribbling furiously on her clipboard, presumably writing up the invoice. I inhaled, counting silently to 3. "Before you do that, I have a letter from my attorney," I started, reaching into my back pocket. She interrupted with a harsh laugh. "Your attorney? Please. This is a civil matter under HOA jurisdiction. You're in violation. I have the board's backing." Fury rose in my chest, but I kept my voice level. "Actually, you don't, because the board president has agreed to meet with me this afternoon, and I've got proof of your unauthorized trespassing. Not once, but twice." Karen's pen paused mid-scribble. For the first time, her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I'm following standard procedure," she said, but the confidence in her voice wavered. I nodded toward Peter, who had reappeared from his truck carrying several wooden posts. "The new fence will be finished by the end of the week," I said, meeting her gaze. "After that, you won't have to worry about being on my property again, because there won't be an easy way in." The color drained from her face. I have every right to do external inspections." "Through a locked gate?" I countered. "If you try to climb over or cut the lock, that's breaking and entering. And with the cameras I have installed, you'll be recorded and reported instantly." For several tense moments, she just stood there, clipboard pressed to her chest, lips parted in silent outrage. Then she spun on her heel and marched back to her car without another word. The engine revved, and she peeled away down the street, nearly sideswiping Linda's mailbox in her haste. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Peter shook his head with a chuckle. "She's a real piece of work," he muttered, then got back to setting up the fence. That afternoon, I kept my appointment with Robert Cartwright, the HOA president, in the association's modest office near the community's entrance. He was a tall, gray-haired man with a tired expression that spoke volumes about the headaches he probably fielded daily. After I laid out Karen's pattern of harassment and showed him the trespassing footage, he rubbed his temples. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention," he said, carefully choosing his words. "Karen has been proactive, but we never intended for her to step on a private property without explicit permission." I snorted. "Proactive? That's one way to put it. Listen, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to enjoy my garden and greenhouse in peace. If the board stands by Karen on this, I'll be forced to pursue legal action." He nodded, lips pressed together. "Understood. I can't speak for the entire board right this moment, but I'll call an emergency meeting tonight. We need to look over the updated versus older bylaws and decide whether your greenhouse qualifies. As for Karen's behavior, we'll address that internally. At the very least, her authority needs clearer limits." His eyes flickered with discomfort, like he was caught between an unhinged subordinate and a fed-up homeowner. But to his credit, he didn't dismiss me, and that was more than Karen had ever done. 2 days later, an official notice arrived at my door, not from Karen, but from the board itself. It stated that upon review, my greenhouse was conditionally approved under a grandfather clause from older bylaws, provided I maintain it properly and keep it under a specified height. I reread the notice 3 times to make sure I wasn't dreaming. A small grin broke out across my face. Victory. Real victory. As for Karen, the notice didn't mention her by name, but I heard through the grapevine that she'd been reassigned. That's HOA speak for stripped of her power. The board decided her trespassing episodes were out of line, and enough residents had lodged formal complaints to make them listen. The rumor was that Karen received a stern warning. Any further overreach would lead to her removal from the HOA entirely. The day my new fence was finished, a small group of neighbors stopped by to congratulate me, Linda included. We shared a few laughs about Karen's downfall, but mostly we were just relieved. I looked out at my greenhouse, no longer under threat of destruction, and felt a wave of contentment wash over me. It took a lot of stress, but the worst was finally behind me. I won't pretend the fight was fun. It wasn't. But there's a certain satisfaction in standing up for yourself. People like Karen rely on intimidation and obscure rules to keep others in line. Once you figure that out and find allies willing to stand beside you, you take away their biggest weapon, fear. And so, with a reinforced fence and a healthy sense of humor, I finally blocked Karen from my property for good. I had my greenhouse, my roses, and a supportive community. Life in Emerald Vista resumed a quiet, neighborly rhythm. And if anyone asked me for advice about dealing with an HOA tyrant, I had a simple answer. Don't back down. Document everything, gather support, and remember, you have every right to enjoy your home, even if someone in a green polo tries to tell you otherwise.